There are few things as painful as burying a soldier who died in combat. However, it is said that this sorrow is only surpassed by the fact of not having remains to bid farewell. This is the fate that many fighters faced during the Vietnam War, due to the hostile terrains in which it unfolded. The eastern jungle and the battles of gunfire left dozens of casualties that became extremely difficult to recover. In today's video, we will explore some specific conflicts that left their victims scattered across Vietnamese soil. We will also share some touching stories of warriors who finally, after many years, returned home. Get ready for a journey into the eastern jungle, among the ghosts of those fallen during the conflict between the United States and the Viet Cong. Welcome again to Military History. The Monument to the Unknown Soldier's Tomb is a commemorative space dedicated to the deceased members of the U.S. service, whose remains remain unidentified. This imposing monument is majestically located in Arlington National Cemetery, Virginia, United States. The unknown heroes resting here not only receive the tribute of their nation, but are also awarded the Medal of Honor, a distinction presented by the President in person. In this sacred place, the memory of these soldiers lives eternally, recalling the brave and anonymous sacrifice of those who gave their lives in service to their country. The areas where the Vietnam War unfolded lie silently, unconsciously hiding a truth beneath their grounds. Bones, remains, or even personal belongings can become tools for a family in eternal mourning to let go of the pain of a lost relative in the conflict. A rusted belt buckle, handcrafted buttons, and a watch stopped at 7:15 compose a mosaic of memories waiting to transform into identities for the nearly 300,000 missing Vietnamese soldiers and the 56,000 American fighters. These modest objects found alongside human remains and other scarce collected data represent the few pieces of evidence nations have to identify their fallen. Third complication for communist forces is that they barely kept records of their personnel, making the identification process more challenging compared to American methods, which had a more professionalized roster. Despite the challenges, Vietnamese search teams look for improvised signs of graves. Some graves were made with metallic fragments and parts of downed American planes, for example. Another method of identification is based on photographs found in uniform pockets and cards with touching messages. At the beginning of the complex identification process, Vietnam experienced limited collaboration from the United States, but later both nations combined efforts. Vietnamese forensic experts have been trained in DNA identification methods, and archivists traveled to American territory to cross-check data. Although the Asian country faces restrictions in terms of resources and records, it persists in the search for soldiers lying in mass graves, hidden throughout the country. On the other hand, the American nation also explores territories carefully and tirelessly, seeking to repatriate the remains of soldiers killed in combat to their families. The government of Vietnam estimates that around 3 million of its inhabitants, including civilians, perished in the war. Of that figure, approximately 1 million were communist fighters. However, only 40% of the recovered remains have been identified, and many graves in the more than 3,000 cemeteries for fighters bear the inscription, "Anonymous Martyr." The number of missing American warriors is considerably smaller, but each of those souls still awaits repatriation. It is necessary to say that the Vietnam War was not the only armed conflict that left a sea of unidentified corpses in its lands, emerging as if they were restless specters. In the remote valley of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, a battle was fought within the framework of the Indochina War that changed the course of events. This epic confrontation, known as the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, became a war milestone that would go down in history books. The stage was set for a monumental clash between French colonial forces and the Viet Minh led by the charismatic Von Nguyen Giap. In a risky gamble, the French established a base in Dien Bien Phu, trusting that their presence in this remote corner of the northern Oriental nation would wear down the determination of the Viet Minh. Let's see footage of the confrontation to understand the dimension of the conflict. However, the apparent tranquility of the jungle concealed the tenacity and cunning of Vietnamese independent forces. As months passed, the siege around Dien Bien Phu tightened, and trenches and barbed wire became a scene stained with Welsh blood. On March 13, 1954, the Viet Minh launched a massive assault against French positions. Under a relentless siege, French soldiers found themselves fighting against a numerically superior force, moving through a hostile landscape and facing clever guerrilla tactics. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu became a struggle of resistance and attrition. Colonial militias, surrounded and outnumbered, were forced to fight against all odds. The hills that once provided security became a disadvantage in a brutal confrontation where every inch of ground was fiercely contested. In May 1954, after 56 days of bloody combat, the French opposition came to an end. The fall of Dien Bien Phu not only sealed the fate of the Indochina War, but also marked the beginning of the end of French colonialism in the region, leaving a toll of over 2,000 French lives. Unexpectedly, in the year 2017, more than 60 years after the conclusion of the conflict, a hidden secret surfaced. Vietnamese workers constructing a park near the former French positions unearthed a mass grave safeguarding the bones of French soldiers fallen in 1954. The workers came across 12 scattered groups of remains where hand grenades and cartridge belts shared space with personal belongings and documents. A collection of memories and relics lay in the depths of the earth, as if waiting to be discovered. This novel revelation is not just an archaeological discovery, but a tangible reminder of the brutality of war and its enduring consequences. It is common for various works and excavations in the areas where the bloody battle took place to unearth human remains of both French and Vietnamese fighters who died unidentified. In the silence of the mass grave, memories awaken, offering a vivid glimpse into a buried past. This time, the remains and belongings allowed for the identification of some local soldiers, and those belonging to French military personnel were sent back to their homeland. The same happens in places where the most fierce battles occurred between local militias and American troops. One of the most numerous and remembered clashes happened on the night of January 30th, 1968. While the world slept, a deafening roar tore through the silence of Vietnamese cities. The Tet Offensive, a coordinated onslaught by the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese People's Army, erupted with relentless fury in the plans of U.S. forces. In the shadows of the night, North Vietnamese soldiers, together with Viet Cong guerrillas dressed in black for camouflage, emerged from tunnels and jungles, slipping through deserted streets. Until then, a temporary truce for the Vietnamese Lunar New Year festivities, known as Tet, had disguised the storm that was brewing. In a surprising strategic twist, communist forces carried out simultaneous attacks in more than 100 cities and towns in the south, defying the rules of a temporary ceasefire. The iconic Citadel of Hue, the former imperial capital, became the scene of savage house-to-house combat. Images recorded in Saigon, the southern capital, were etched into the world's collective memory when the U.S. Embassy became a besieged stronghold by Vietnamese guerrillas. Amid urban chaos, the war ceased to be a distant conflict and became a brutal intrusion into the daily lives of civilians. Although communist forces were repelled in many places, the Tet Offensive left indelible scars on the perception of the conflict. The surprise and audacity of the attacks bewildered American forces and their South Vietnamese allies, who until then seemed to have control of the conflict. Vietnamese strategists knew they could not win in conventional military terms, so they sought to win on the psychological and political fronts with the Tet Offensive. The onslaught aimed to undermine the confidence of the American public in the war. And in that aspect, it was a devastating success. Images of urban combat and the assault on the U.S. Embassy shook the American people. Not only did the perception that victory was within reach reverse, but there was also growing skepticism about young Americans becoming cannon fodder, especially because this sacrifice was made for reasons that responded to international interests rather than patriotic duty.
What I see when I look at that photo today are 7, 18, 19, 20-year-old kids, badly wounded. It's painful to look at.
In the conflict, about 4,000 young Americans were killed. Many of them still lie in anonymous graves or directly buried secretly in unknown corners of the eastern country. Most are missed and mourned by their families on the American continent, thinking they will never recover their remains. However, occasionally, the miracle happens that one of these young men's bodies manages to come home. On February 7, 1968, during an enemy attack, Army First Sergeant James W. Holt, handling a 100mm recoilless rifle, exhausted his ammunition, destroying an enemy tank. His comrades reported seeing him for the last time running toward the ammunition depot, and since then he was declared missing in action. Over the years, uncertainty surrounded Holt's fate. However, fate shed light on his sacrifice when, in 1989, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam handed over remains believed to be those of an American soldier. Although the technology of the time did not allow for identification, recent scientific and forensic advances, including mitochondrial DNA analysis and Y chromosome short tandem repeat analysis, finally brought answers. On May 5, 2015, the Department of Defense announced the closure of a pending chapter. The remains of the brave soldier who had been killed during the confrontation in Quang Tri Province were finally identified and returned to his family with all the military honors he deserved. Holt, 26 years old, was buried in Arlington National Cemetery on May 14, 2015, marking the end of decades of waiting for his loved ones. The Tet Offensive marked a turning point in the war, forcing a re-evaluation both in Washington and on the battlefield to prevent young men like Holt from losing their lives. The intensity of the fighting and the psychological impact led to growing opposition to the conflict among the American people, triggering a series of events that would eventually lead to the withdrawal of troops from Vietnam. But there was still some way to go before reaching that point. The high-ranking military leaders still had one more blunder to commit in their confrontation with the Viet Cong. In the heart of the A Shau Valley jungle, in May 1969, a battle unfolded that would be etched in the history of the Vietnam War. This conflict, known as the Battle of Hamburger Hill, was to become a symbol of resistance for Americans who opposed the war. Hamburger Hill, named for its steep and challenging topography, became a coveted strategic point for U.S. forces. Nestled amidst dense vegetation and rugged terrain, the hill posed a formidable challenge, but also a crucial objective for area control. Or at least that's what those directing the U.S. strategy claimed, as testimonies from some soldiers of that time suggest that the territory had minimal tactical value. On May 10, 1969, predominantly composed of the 101st Airborne Division, troops launched Operation Apache Snow to take Hamburger Hill. What followed was a fierce and brutal struggle against a determined resistance from the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong. Conditions were hellish. The dense jungle and rugged terrain made every step difficult for foreigners unfamiliar with the land. Soldiers advanced through a labyrinth of vegetation and insects, facing not only the invisible enemy, but also the harsh tropical weather and the exhausting burden of military equipment. Day after day, U.S. forces assaulted the hill, only to be repelled by fierce resistance. Local enemy artillery, deadly traps, and treacherous terrain resulted in numerous casualties. The conflict reached its tensest point during the second week of May. In a series of coordinated assaults, American soldiers finally secured the summit of the hill. However, victory came at a devastating cost. Hundreds of lives were lost on the battlefield, and the conquered land was grimly renamed by the victors as Hill of the Meat Grinder. The Battle of Hamburger Hill sparked controversy and criticism in the United States. Many questioned the strategy and the human cost of taking a hill that would eventually be abandoned shortly afterward, due to its almost negligible usefulness in the conflict. The escalation of the Vietnam War and the loss of lives fueled the growing cultural and social opposition to the war. The hill, soaked with the blood of young Americans, became the last straw. Government authorities were forced to negotiate the withdrawal of troops, thus reaching the end of the conflict. The heroes who died on Hamburger Hill were partly responsible for bringing the Vietnam War to a permanent end. Unfortunately, the American people cannot pay tribute to many of them, as their remains remain buried in the anonymity of the jungle.
After 10 days of brutal fighting, U.S. forces successfully secure Hill 937. The cost to the U.S.? 70 American soldiers killed and 372 wounded. The cost to the enemy? More than 600 killed.
Fortunately, there are moments when a light appears at the end of the tunnel for those hoping that their boys will return to their homeland to be buried with the honors they deserve. On September 10, 2023, after decades of uncertainty and waiting, Captain Frederick Mervyn Hall finally found his eternal rest. This brave member of the United States Air Force served as a crew member on a Phantom II aircraft during the Vietnam War. On April 12, 1969, his fate would change forever when he and Colonel Ernest Leo de Soto, his pilot, embarked on a bombing mission. Unfortunately, this operation would tragically become their last flight. The fate of their bodies would become a mystery. Ernie Edwards, Captain Hall's lifelong friend, narrates the events that surrounded that fateful day. Two phantoms went through a bank of clouds for about 10 seconds. Only one of the phantoms emerged. The other disappeared from the face of the earth for the next 54 years. The Department of Defense initially identified the crash site in May 1995, but adverse weather conditions and the presence of undetonated munitions hindered the extraction. It was not until March 23, 2023, that the site was excavated, finally confirming Captain Hall's identity. This discovery is a profound and closing moment for those who have carried the weight of grief and uncertainty about Hall's whereabouts for decades.
I thought, oh my God, he's finally home. I thank God Almighty that he was finally home.
But the story does not end there. The narrative also takes us to the case of Air Force Colonel Ernest de Soto, his flight companion who stood by him until the end. In an emotional arrival at San Francisco International Airport, his wife led the procession that welcomed de Soto back home. Thus, a painful chapter was finally closed, bringing peace to their loved ones and the long-awaited eternal rest for the fighter. Despite these heartwarming stories with happy endings, there still exists a dark side to the events narrated. The memory of the 1,627 still missing and unidentified members of the U.S. military from the Vietnam War persists. Similarly, and in even more painful numbers, tens of thousands of Vietnamese soldiers share the same fate, turned into ghosts still waiting to be rescued from oblivion and anonymity. Vietnam's and the United States' commitment to identifying their missing reflects not only an act of justice but also a profound respect for those who gave their lives in a conflict that left indelible scars on the history of both countries. In this way, we are reaching the end of today's poignant video. We appreciate you staying until the conclusion, and we look forward to welcoming you in the upcoming installments of Military History.